Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Talking Nuclear. This is an initiative of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network to engage our senior network members in conversation on nuclear issues. I attended a seminar that was titled, "Is the Rules-Based Order Still Alive?" While most of the participants expressed concern at the state of affairs in the world, all agreed that the world could not survive unless it ran on some rules. As a subset of the international order, the global nuclear order too requires some orderliness that is created by rules. Do we have them? How are they doing? How strong are they? Are they fraying? To talk about these issues today, I have with me Mr. John Tilemann, an Australian diplomat with extensive experience in nuclear and other international security policy issues. He represented Australia at a variety of international forums, including the NPT review conferences, the Proliferation Security Initiative. He's attended the ASEAN Regional Forum, the export control regimes, including Australia Group, Nuclear Suppliers Group, and the Wassenaar Agreement. He was Australia's Deputy Permanent Representative to the IAEA and later served as Chief of Staff to two of the former Director Generals of the IAEA. So he has extensive understanding of how these organizations function. He was also Research Director of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network from 2016 to 2019, besides teaching diplomacy and multilateral negotiations for some time now. So, John, you seem to be the right person to help us understand today's global nuclear challenges. The world has never been in great order, but what was it like when you were handling some of these issues? And do you think that currently we are facing a more alarming or a more volatile set of international affairs?
Well, thank you, Manpreet, for that wonderful introduction, and I hope I can live up to the promise you've made for me. But if you'll indulge, let me start with a bit of personal history. My outlook on the world was really shaped by two major issues that impinged on my teenage mind back in the 1960s. So I'm very much a product of those 60s years, the threat of nuclear weapons, particularly the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. I remember vividly, and it led me to become a ban the bomber and a follower of Bertrand Russell. And then, not too long after, the Vietnam War, and very specifically the threat that I might be forced to serve in the Australian military. I thought the war was wrong-headed and had no wish at all to be part of it. So the world of the 60s was for me certainly alarming and nevertheless possibly less volatile than today. As you pointed out, the rules are needed, but the rules today are very much under discussion as to just how lasting and how certain they are. When I started my career, of course, it was the Cold War. And the Cold War, to my mind, did impose a measure of predictability and perhaps even commanded a degree of respect between the opposing camps. I even spent a couple of years behind the Iron Curtain in Poland. And that was the time of the historic visit of Pope John Paul II in 1979. That visit convinced me that the Ostblock, as it was referred to in those days, would not survive too long. I was heavily engaged on nuclear issues in the late 80s and into the 90s, mostly in Vienna, where we experienced firsthand the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I was heavily engaged in nuclear issues in those days in the Australian Embassy in Vienna. And they were exciting times to be both in the embassy in the late 80s and then with the IAEA Secretariat in the 1990s. We had the challenge of the DPRK in Iraq. Well, as history tells us, we did not do very well there, at least with relation to DPRK. But we also had the exciting event of dismantling the South African nuclear program. We had the strengthening of IAEA safeguards, the additional protocol. We brought in the former Soviet Union countries into the NPT and into the IAEA. And then there was the indefinite extension of the NPT. So there were some amazing events happening in Vienna. And this was, of course, buttressed by the arms control that was being achieved between Washington and Moscow. Now, all that scrapped. But by 2000, my career took another turn, and I was in the Middle East and watching as Iraq was invaded, the excuse being that Iraq had WMD. That conclusion was against the advice of the IAEA that had, at that time led by Mohammed al-Baradei, and quite clearly had confirmed that the Iraqi nuclear program was no longer of any concern. And equally, my former boss, Dr. Hans Blix, who by that time was the head of the UNMO, the United Nations Monitoring and Verification Inspection Commission. UNMOVIC had also found that the likelihood of any substantive quantities of WMD in Iraq were next to zero. So I found little in that situation to give me reason for optimism about the way the world was tracking. And the next 25 years may have had some moments like Obama's Prague speech, but generally it's been a downhill journey. But certainly the current chaos in global world affairs approximates the worst of the Cold War, but now with greater lack of confidence that there's any sane thinking going on in capitals. And we see little evidence that there is a commitment to avoiding war and avoiding the misuse of nuclear weapons. So again, yes, more volatile than any time in my lifetime.
Looking at some of the newer technologies, I mean, not only is the geopolitical environment changed, but also the technological environment has changed so much. So we are looking at some of the new technologies like cyber, like artificial intelligence, even new types of missiles like hypersonic missiles, which is changing the landscape. So do you think these new technologies themselves, which are without any guardrails right now, uh, how do we get a sense of this landscape with the new technologies?
Now, this is extremely interesting area and one which I'm rushing to try and keep up with. But on the other hand, it has to be acknowledged that new technologies have been impinging on the way we deal with security issues, has always been the case. And like nuclear itself, these new technologies have their benefits and they have their downsides. But I can remember vividly, for example, when satellite imagery was introduced into the arms control arena. And that was back in the early 1990s when, if you allow me to give a very specific example of this, because in 1992, at some point in 1992, a series of slides were shown, projected in the IAEA boardroom. And these were about North Korea. And these started with a slide showing a nice green countryside, little forest, and the next slide was some major earthworks, civil engineering, and a lot of concrete being poured. The next thing that was covered over and became a functional something or other. And then the slides went on to the point that that functioning facility no longer functioned. It was covered over with a mound of earth, and trees were planted on top, and some military emplacements were added to it. Well, that turned out to be the waste disposal facility for Yongbyon. and it was the telling evidence that DPRK had been involved in reprocessing. I must say the faces of the board members on that day were really quite something to watch, because others, I no doubt, were thinking, well, what about us? They must be able to see what we're doing with equal clarity and drawing conclusions. Well, as it was, that was the beginning of the campaign to try and get the DPRK to come back into the NPT fold, which, as we know, did not succeed. And similarly, for example, environmental monitoring and particle analysis became tools of the IAEA in the 1990s. And this was a staggering advance in the power of the inspectors to tell very precisely what had been going on. We, in fact, played with it here in Australia. Well, we invited the IAEA to do sampling around our nuclear research establishment, and they very precisely tracked everything that had been done there over the preceding 50 years, including stuff which we had subsequently given up, like playing with reprocessing and playing with enrichment. But they very clearly were able to pick it all up. So, short of it all, I guess, is that these developments can work to our benefit as well as have the negative sides. But as you're implying, of course, what we're talking about now is the stability of nuclear relations. And I agree very much with your suggestion that the situation today is really quite challenging. I can't judge how artificial intelligence is going to play out, but I can see very clearly, for example, things like missile defense and hypersonic missiles can very easily change the stability of nuclear relations and destabilizing what may have been previously rather stable bilateral relations. And then the question is, how can these new technologies undo that stability? And the problem, as I see it, is it gets back without rules, without agreements on allowing a stable relationship to exist. Countries find it very hard not to go down the path of utilizing any new technology that comes to hand. And not only do the militaries demand the chance to exploit the possibility, publics probably also would not understand why a country arguably is making itself more vulnerable. So it's extraordinarily difficult, and that's where the lack of any mechanisms for negotiating more stability is very disturbing.
Unfortunately, right now, as you said, amongst the dyads and also where they elongate into strategic chains, there are no conversations between countries. And even if these technologies are coming fast at you, the conversations about these issues amongst nations for strategic stability seem to be so slow and non-existent, actually. But talking about new things that have entered the nuclear landscape, one of them is also the terminology AUKUS. And since you do come from Australia, and this is an agreement between Australia, UK, and US, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what is AUKUS going to mean. I mean, we all understand the security dimension with which Australia has gotten into this. But as a non-proliferation expert who spent, your entire life on non-proliferation, do you think there are repercussions here that AUKUS could be bringing in?
Yes, thanks for raising this one, Manpreet. It's very much on my mind, I have to say, currently. And I've not had a problem with nuclear propulsion. That doesn't concern me. What does concern me on the non-proliferation side is the use of HEU. I think it's most unfortunate as a country that had been, along with many others, saying, get rid of HEU, this is bad stuff, we don't need it. And now suddenly we say, well, we do need it, and it's good for us. The only counter to that concern, put to me by one person, but only one, I think, that the more we use up in submarines, the less there is out there for other purposes. Okay, that's maybe a slight tick, but I think it's just a bad. If we want to free the world of HEU, fissile materials more generally, then it's not a good thing to be sort of saying this is what we need to have for this purpose. Second aspect is strategic. And that's a critique of Australia's defence policies. It seems I'm not a supporter of the notion that we need to have that capability. It's a very specific capability of playing with the Chinese on matters which for them are of strategic importance. So our submarines are not just going to be waving the flag, and they're not going to be working in the Pacific. They're not going to be working in Southeast Asia. Well, they will be near to Southeast Asia, but they're going to be working the waters around China. And to my mind, that is not where we should be putting all our effort. We're already putting quite a bit of effort into it with aerial surveillance capabilities and other naval deployments in the region. But this would just be, I think, not in Australia's interest and not helpful to the strategic balance between China and the US, for that matter. The issue at hand is, of course, whether these arrangements for nuclear submarines, and it won't be just Australia, Brazil's on the way, and Korea, still not totally clear, but I think we'll go down that track, and why not Japan as well? But can they be safeguarded? Can we be sure that this won't be a backdoor to acquiring fissile material for weapons? I think the answer is clearly it is a low and very manageable risk. It hasn't been quite worked out how it's going to be done yet. But basically, when this stuff is locked in a reactor in a submarine, it's not going to go anywhere very easily. So I think it's not beyond the wit of the IAEA and member states, because Australia, and for that matter, the US and UK, all want to be absolutely certain that the world is confident we're not going to do anything funny with that material. And I'm sure we can find a way to do that. But it will take some time.
Yeah, in fact, the concerns that I've heard, I mean, Australia or Brazil would all be good faith members of the NPT going down this path. But there could be other countries, because this sets a precedent for others as well. And the concern has been some of the others might not be all those good faith members of the NPT. But speaking of the NPT, John, since you've been part of the previous review conferences, I mean, how did we navigate some of the difficult times in the past? And do you think we'll be able to do that into the future?
So what happens in the review conferences is really an effort to, I mean, they can be very expensive and there can be a lot of time wasted, but they're an opportunity to try and nudge the nuclear weapons states forward. It is, after all, the last only commitment they've ever made to disarm. And so that's a lever that's well worth keeping and using to encourage them to progress matters. The review conferences also do provide endless discussion, which could occasionally produce good outcomes. The problem is that the NPT review processes, like so many international arrangements, work by the consensus rule. And that means basically the outcome is determined by the last outrider in the whole discussion. And many times the NPT conference has had quite useful exchanges and come to a huge measure of agreement on a preferred outcome, only to be stymied at the end of the day by a handful of countries, sometimes only one or two, that say, no, if we don't get our comment in about this or that. Often these sticking points are also arguably extraneous to the business of the NPT, so we don't get a final document. But that, to my mind, is really not a huge issue. The work has been done. There's a huge measure of agreement. And the bottom line is no one is leaving the NPT for the time being.
That is really a very reassuring thing to hear in today's times. But looking also a little bit into the past on how effective have traditional multilateral export controls been historically, because some of these export controls are again under stress because of other concerns, national interests, getting in the way of the larger global good that some of these export controls were meant for. So again, I mean, do you see it in today's time as a relevant tool of statecraft still, or do you think these could be fraying in the future?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, and I've spent a lot of time in these mechanisms, and they have served a purpose, and some of them have been able to adjust quite well. The ones I've been involved in, just briefly, on the nuclear side, there was the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which still operates, and it still does its job of trying to ensure that items, it supports the NPT and to an extent the IAEA by having some oversight over the transfer of sensitive items. There was an earlier one, the Zanger Committee, which was NPT related. Now that I believe still exists, but it's more or less on hold because it's been overtaken by the NSG. So often these international mechanisms, once created, they don't generally die, they just fade away. And the Zanger Committee has done that. That's okay. And the NSG is still doing its job. The Australia group, which is the one dealing with chemical and biological weapons, I believe is still, again, keeping up with the work of identifying new elements to the chemical and biological weapons scenery, items that need to be looked at carefully, and which there's a lot of technical work goes on behind the scenes there, negotiating what items go on the lists so that they can be controlled. In a sense, the Australia Group is the only body which is doing something to try and define the things that need to be controlled and alerting countries to the need to put those controls in place. And the third one, of course, is the Conventional Weapons Group, the Wassenaar Arrangement. I'll come back to that. But I think the problem with these groups is they were very effective in the early days when there was nothing else happening. Nowadays, the problem as the technology holders, the population of technology holders has widened, the degree of like-mindedness in the group, of course, diminishes. Yes, they've become more democratic, and there's no point in having these groups if the real creators and manufacturers of the technologies aren't involved, But certainly this has meant over time a lessening of the degree of like-mindedness within the groups, and that has made them much harder to manage and ensure productive outcomes from the work. I don't know how that will go, frankly, but I think for the time being, they still, on balance, are serving a useful purpose. I was involved in the Arms Trade Treaty negotiation which was concluded in 2012, I think it was. The point about it was that what the Arms Trade Treaty essentially did was took the control lists developed by the Wassenaar Arrangement and made them into a global instrument. So the Wassenaar Arrangement morphed over time. It was once a body called COCOM, which was a Western consortium designed to block stuff going to the Soviet bloc. And then after 1990, the enemy was invited in, and it was broadened out to be East-West consortium of major conventional arms manufacturers and suppliers, and they defined ways of controlling or devised guidelines for how countries should monitor their exports and the principles under which, some of the principles under which that should occur. As I say, that has now been taken on board by the Arms Trade Treaty. I don't think it's eliminated the role of the Wassenaar Arrangement, but it's certainly changed its character.
Thank you, John. Let me also pick a little bit on your IAEA experience. So, given the conflicts in Ukraine and Iran, there is heightened attention to the role that the IAEA needs to play in conflict zones. What mechanisms do you think can the IAEA utilize to enforce the norm against non-attack on civilian facilities? This was taken to be a norm that was settled in a sense, but suddenly it's no longer settled, and we've seen nuclear facilities in conflict zones come under some kind of a cloud. So, where do you see the IAEA being able to do anything about this?
Yeah, look, I mean, my first point, I guess, would be that in relation to the Ukraine, I think the IAEA has really done an amazing job. IAEA inspectors remain on site, I think, to this day in incredible circumstances. And while there has been a lot of interference with the facilities there and some very risky activities, including the cutting off of the power supply and whatever else. So even though the reactors are all shut down, they need to have electricity to keep them cool and that sort of stuff. But in a way which was really a bit outside of its mandate, it was making things up as it went along in getting people into Zaporizhzhia and doing what they were doing. But Grossi has handled it extremely well. The legal framework, of course, as you know, is sort of there, and so in a way is being respected. In Iran, it's been respected in the sense that Bushehr hasn't been attacked in any way. So it gets back to the real world, doesn't it, I suppose, when we go back to Osirak, the Iraqi reactor which the Israelis took out in the 80s and which caused enormous ruptures in the international community and led to the international measures to protect nuclear facilities. And that was all done in the name of non-proliferation because Israel accused Iraq of having non-peaceful intentions. So I think that in a way, to my mind, what needs to be done is, well, we have to get the non-proliferation bits right. I think the JCPOA would have been a way of buying a lot of time and perhaps solving the problem. But when confidence in the non-proliferation framework weakens, then I'm afraid all bets are off. But I think it goes to a broader question, doesn't it? I mean, in a way, and India and Pakistan have done this in their own bilateral context. I think what we should be looking at is various layers of protection. It can be bilateral. It'd be good to have a regional one, a broader one, maybe in South Asia. Certainly East Asia ought to be thinking along these lines. I'd say it's a fertile area for further work.
Absolutely. I so agree with you, especially because there is so much interest in nuclear energy today, and countries are thinking of expanding their power programs. So, some kind of agreements where you would not want to go attacking them because it's not in anybody's interest to have, a radiological radiation disaster there. So we are glad nothing has happened as of now in Iran, in today's time. But I have just two quick questions now. One is to draw on your experience in the APLN. You've spent some time here in the APLN building up this institution, and I'm wondering what are your thoughts today on what is the role of such institutions?
Look, I think all those things, and the problem in our region in particular, but it's also true now in the Atlantic, but there's just no infrastructure for management of the strategic issues. And there is pressure as a result of other security developments, in particular what I refer to as the Lotus crisis, and the loss of trust in the United States. It's shaking everybody's confidence in the systems that are in place. In our region, the US operated their relationships on this hub and spokes arrangement. Unlike the European scene where you had NATO and then you had the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, a major sort of forum for everybody to talk security matters. Now, however much that's now been destroyed, and however much the OSCE is now looking for a role, we've had none of that experience in our part of the world. The ASEAN-led organizations, the ASEAN Regional Forum and the East Asia Summit, they're great institutions, but they just have not really got traction. I think the members of the APLN can be encouraged to speak out and speak up. Really what we need to get things moving, I believe, it has to come from the top. It has to come from Prime Minister Modi or President Xi or President Prabowo. One or more of them have got to get together and say, this is not good. We've got to shift things along. But it will take leadership. And I think probably the best thing that APLN can do is try and appeal to the leaders in the region with practical proposals for their consideration. Hopefully mobilize some of our more senior people to tackle governments directly. We do have to come up with some very practical proposals, but we do have the resources, I think, within the organization to help.
Thank you so much, John. We could have gone on for several more, minutes talking about these issues, but I think we are out of time. So thank you so much, John, for sparing the time to share your expertise with us. And we'll keep coming back to you as and when we have other questions lined up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.